It's yet another episode of African Business Weekly. This week we'll be looking at stories that directly impact the sub-Saharan Africa business landscape. I am Kanyisile Kayimpi. From what CEOs in East Africa perceive as macroeconomic risks to drivers of Ghana's foreign direct investment, on this week's episode we'll kickstart from the Southern Africa region where Palisa is on standby to take us through stories that shaped headlines this week.
Economic growth in the sub-Saharan region is set to slow from 3.6% in 2022 to 3.1% in 2023. This according to the latest Africa Pulse report. To kickstart the stories we covered in Southern Africa region this week, my colleague Tanya Habimana caught up with Andrew Dabalin, Chief Economist for Africa at the World Bank. Let's listen in.
As you stated, the growth is slated to slow down from about 3.6% in 2022 to about 3.1% because global growth remains weak. The recovery for growth in the global economy remains weak. There is a lot of performance in the investment field, and inflation remains high, even though we believe that it has actually peaked. And then finally, the combination of high interest rates, high debt, and fiscal space constraints that are facing a lot of African countries are making it difficult for these countries to actually finance investments and core development activities.
Now, curious
so
to get
those are the reasons for slow growth in the region.
Okay, now curious to get the breakdown in terms of countries. Who's dragging the most and who's boosting the forecast?
So the growth for the region is obviously dragged down by the underperformance of the largest economies in the region, which is Nigeria and South Africa, and partly Angola. All those three countries are underperforming. Their growth rates are below the average for the region. Nigeria is growing at 2.8%. We have downgraded South Africa's growth from about 2% to about 0.5%. And Angola is also around 2.3%. So that's what those are the three major economies that potentially account for almost 50% of the region's GDP. And so when they're not doing well, the region will not be doing well. The countries that are doing relatively better are in the West, countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Niger. And then in the East and Central, countries like DRC, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. And you can see that there is a mix of countries that rely on natural resources. For example, the demand for minerals that is powering the growth in DRC, for example. And then other countries that are relying more on a diversified economy. So especially the small economies like Cote d'Ivoire and Benin and Rwanda.
Now, I want to tap into South Africa precisely. To what extent is the current power crisis a resulting factor of that revised forecast?
Yeah, the power sector is obviously huge in terms of short-term growth forecast. It affects companies' production. Factories are going to be affected by how quickly they can, how rapidly they can actually scale up their production. And so it's very disruptive.
South Africa is currently the third largest foreign direct investment in Ghana. This according to the South African High Commissioner to Ghana. After walking a mile in the energy crisis, Ghana is set to invest in South Africa's energy sector. My colleague Zanele Morrison caught up with the South Africa High Commissioner to Ghana, Grace Mason. Let's watch.
That is the expertise, and they've got investment into that sector, into the energy sector, and that's the skill and that is the investment that they are bringing. So there is an investment company, Sunon Asogli Energy, and they simply want to replicate the infrastructure that they've put in Ghana in the energy sector, and we're looking at Richards Bay now. The investors are currently having conversations at the one-stop shop now with DTI and looking at the investment. And this is an investment cumulative of $12 billion rands.
So it's not only just the solution, but there's a lot of skills transfer that's going to take place from Ghana based on their own experience that now makes sense to us. Ghana also takes very seriously the Africa Free Trade Agreements. Do you see them leading in being an importer and an exporter? Do you see South Africa playing a good game as well when it comes to opening up our shores for trade with Ghana?
Currently, the trade between South Africa and Ghana, there's a lot of trade. The trade is in excess of over $8 billion per annum. So currently, what we're trying to do and the trajectory of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that is a platform that we will leverage on in terms of African trade. Currently, that is regional between the ECOWAS and SADC regionally. But within South Africa, what we're exporting is skills transfer that we are exporting now. And South Africa now has, and it's just developing the niches in our markets, looking at what are the comparative advantages for Ghana agriculture. So South Africa will come and invest in agriculture. Minister Toko Didliza will soon, in a few months' time, then lead a delegation to bring expertise and investment into agriculture. With Ghana now, and what I've seen over the past few months now, with South Africa, in terms of training, we've got training that we now provide for their pilots, training for nurses, as well, and that is a niche because what Ghanaians would then do, the nurses, if they want to apply or get promotions or go and work abroad and apply for job opportunities in the UK, in Canada, there's a prerequisite for a certain qualification that on the continent is only in South Africa. So we're getting any volumes of applications and nurses applying to come to South Africa to go do the training as well, and also just to use tourism now as a low-hanging fruit and just to promote in the creative design. That's where we collaborate, South Africa and Ghana, in our music, in our creatives. So there's a lot of compatibility between South Africa and Ghana.
That's it from the Southern Africa team. It's back to you.
Thanks, Palisa. Let's now link up with Akin Obakie in Nigeria for the West African news flow.
Now, Nigeria and Ghana have approved the R21 Matrix M malaria vaccine by the University of Oxford as part of the prevention of clinical malaria in children from 5 months to 36 months of age. Ifeanyi Nsofo, Senior New Voices Fellow at the Aspen Institute and a Senior Atlantic Fellow for Health Equity at George Washington University, joined us earlier to examine the impact the vaccine will have in the fight against malaria.
I think that the approvals are fine so far, and I'm happy that Nigeria has followed the path of Ghana. I understand that, WHO has to do all its, play its part as far as, finalizing everything, but, that would come, I think as soon as possible. It's a big deal if you consider the fact that malaria is, kills so many people, especially children under 5 across Africa. So it's a good thing. I will not be bothered about, all the other things that have to happen before everybody gets on board, because I think it's something that is really worth celebrating.
And part of what NAFDAC is also looking at is an expansion of the clinical trials, even outside Nigeria. And part of the highlights from this whole vaccine production is the fact that we're also expecting a factory to be set up in Ghana as well. What's your take on this as well, for the fact that we are not necessarily having a clear mention that such will be had here in Nigeria? Is it expected that that facility will feed West Africa? Clarity is yet to come to bear from that.
Well, I mean, it's likely just about 45 minutes by air from Lagos to Accra, so it's likely that may happen. But I think for me, why I'm really very happy about that is because if you look at all the pushback that we got from COVID-19 and manufacturing COVID-19 vaccines on the continent, and all the progress that has been made for us to get to this level where we're even beginning to talk about manufacturing the malaria vaccine on the continent, I think is really a big deal. But of course, if we have facility in Nigeria, to also manufacture the vaccine. I think it's also a good thing because if you population-wise, we're probably up to 8 times the population of Ghana. So if there's any country that should service the West African sub-region, I think it's Nigeria.
Yeah.
But, let's also not get ahead of ourselves because manufacturing the vaccine will not happen overnight. It may take, a few years
yes,
for that to happen. Yeah.
But in terms of now the efficacy of this vaccine, it has a success rate of about 70 to 80%. This is quite commendable for this sort of feat. But however, the same old issues still remain. We're yet to have very solid sensitization. Sanitary and hygiene issues still remain same. So to what extent do you think we might be able to fight this scourge completely, even with the provision of the vaccine, which also talks to some financial concerns in terms of production?
Yeah, I mean, the efficacy is quite high, but, the vaccine is not a magic bullet if we don't do, other aspects of malaria prevention and treatment. In fact, I wrote a piece on the malaria vaccine, coincidentally, in 2019 for Project Syndicate. And some of the things I highlighted was, in as much as vaccines are good, vaccines are recommended for us to deal with infectious diseases, we need to deal with other things. So, for instance, you've spoken about sanitation. If you look across Nigeria and so many parts of West Africa, we're still dealing with sanitation. We're dealing with climate change that, is leading to emergence of worsening of infectious diseases. You're dealing with people having access to malaria nets, insecticide-treated nets for you to prevent malaria. You're dealing with poor power supply, because even where people have access to insecticide-treated nets, using it, under very hot conditions, is really not the ideal situation, and that's why you may find, people not even using the net when they have the net. So we need to deal with all those things so that, I think it's very important for us to put this forward, that the fact you have a malaria vaccine that is up to 80% efficacious will not solve our problems entirely. We need to deal with those issues.
Meanwhile, the United Nations World Food Programme says about 4.3 million people in Nigeria's Borno, Adamawa and Yobe states are at risk of facing severe hunger in the third quarter of this year, with about 600,000 of them on the brink of catastrophe. David Stevenson, the country director at the WFP in Nigeria, discussed ways to avert the looming crisis.
This year's Cadre Harmonise, which is a common framework looking at food security and hunger in Nigeria and indeed across West Africa, has looked at 21 states. And that's a change from the focus on the north, particularly the northeast and northwest in previous years. And what they found is over the 21 states in Nigeria, there is about 25 million Nigerians in dire need of food assistance due to food insecurity. That involves 4.3 million people in the Northeast, which is continues to be the World Food Program and the international efforts led by government primary concern, and the same amount of people in the Northwest. Of that amount, very alarming that 2 million in the Northeast are children, and 700,000 children are at risk of severe acute malnutrition, which is a quadrupling times 4 of the nutrition problem in previous years. So we're really going in the wrong direction.
All right, but still looking at your finding, I see that you've picked these 21 states. I'm trying to understand the idea behind, or the philosophy behind picking these particular states other than the other states in Nigeria.
Well, it's a good question, and it's been a progressive issue of capacity building over the years. This effort started in the North and the Northeast, led by government, but also involving United Nations agency, the World Food Program, where we have deep field presence. We have about 360 staff and are working out in the most remote areas, particularly where there's the conflict. But other agencies like UNICEF, like the Food and Agricultural Organization, a number of NGOs working under the leadership of government at the state and the district level, as well as the federal level Ministry of Planning and Statistics that coordinates it. So once we got the methodology right, where it mattered the most, up in the north, we've been able to move it down to the 21 states, selected states, to continue this analysis. And I would expect in future years, it will cover the entire country. given the need to continue to assess and reassess issues of food availability and nutrition throughout Nigeria.
Yeah, because you're calling for urgent actions here to address these issues, but still around the methodology, I'm still trying to understand how the cadre harmonize is built to address a construct like food and insecurity. Speak to more or less the methodology that came about these conclusions.
So again, it involves a deep field presence led by government with enumerators out in the field, doing interviews with people, assessing the vulnerability. Where we don't have accessibility, for example, in the Northeast, because of the conflict, we're looking at interviewing people that come into the safe areas and understanding better how the situation is in the more remote, inaccessible areas. But for the most part, there is firsthand information available now, given to a much more professionalized, sophisticated system of vulnerability analysis, one that the World Food Program and partners have been at the cutting edge, and now is being developed and is very well organized and credible throughout the region, and certainly here in Nigeria. So we are very interested in the findings. It's an inclusive process. The methodology is solid, and the findings are very, very credible and important to draw conclusions on, shape policy, and provide an appropriate humanitarian and longer-term response.
And that's all from West Africa.
Thanks a lot, Akin. It has been revealed that Ethiopia is in talks with the IMF to borrow at least $2 billion under a reform program. To shed more light on this, CNBC Africa's Fiona Mutoni was joined by Zimedine Nigatu, Global Chairman at Fairfax Africa Fund.
As you indicated, there was an Ethiopian delegation that went through the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. Although Ethiopia has been engaging with the IMF and the World Bank for the last several months on what's called the Homegrown Economic Reform Program Phase 2, which will be for the next 10 years. So as part of an overall reform program, my understanding from the media reports and others, Ethiopia is working with those two institutions to provide funding for its growth trajectory that is forecast up to 2030 and beyond. And now there are some numbers. I think Reuters reported $2 billion is what's been requested. We don't know what officially it is, but it is part of the transformation program. And also, just to add to that, as you know, last week, a number of African countries, including Ethiopia, were encouraging or urging the IMF and the World Bank to focus on an accelerated restructuring of debt. So Ethiopia has been one of the first countries about 2-3 years ago to seek those kinds of, debt restructuring as part of, an overall economic control program. So that's what we know as of today.
Yeah, I mean, Reginald, still going back to the reports that are coming in, we've seen the first IMF debt analysis for Ethiopia. The IMF has calculated that Ethiopia might face a financing gap of about $6 billion until 2024. Let's say the $2 billion they manage to get it. Where will the funding to bridge the remaining $4 billion come from?
I don't know the exact number, the 6 billion figure, but remember, if I put something in context for you, actually the IMF is forecasting for the Ethiopian economy in 2023 to grow by 6.2%. In fact, it's estimated that it will be the fastest growing of the 5 largest economies in sub-Saharan Africa. So they have their own sources of revenue, but there are, as you know, Ethiopia has multiple partners globally to fund its refinancing needs, and one of them is the IMF. As I said, I'm not sure about the $2 billion. It could be a higher figure, but there are the U.S. government, the Europeans, the Asian, and in particular China is a big player in Ethiopia. So I don't think they will have a challenge filling that $5 or $6 billion that you mentioned, because both domestic but internationally, multiple partners. As you know, subsequent to the peace treaty that was signed in November, multiple partners. I mean, the Italian Prime Minister was in Addis just this weekend, for example. The Ethiopian Prime Minister was in Europe on a roadshow tour about a month ago. So there are multiple partners who can fill in the gap. And the size of Ethiopia's economy was about, $156 billion, according to the IMF, who just came out last week. $6 billion is not a very large gap to fill, and I think they can get it from various sources, especially since the economy is projected to grow by 6.3 and 7% in 2024. So these are big, encouraging numbers, both obviously for the domestic economy, but also for the development partners of Ethiopia.
I mean, definitely. Ethiopia is actually, I've seen in about 10 years, might surpass Kenya's economy. So that really shows the growth potential that it has. But still looking at the present times, we've seen the different macroeconomic effects that have been impacting the whole world. Ethiopia, the macroeconomic dynamics have also widened for the country. We've seen deteriorating external position, also maybe declining international reserve. What measures has the government put in place to address the current macroeconomic dynamics?
A very good point. Again, context is important. As you know, since 2020, with COVID hit, subsequent to that, the war in the northern part of Ethiopia, which has now come to an end, and then the Russia-Ukraine, so this is what I call a triple whammy, hit the economy. But the interesting thing is, the economy, and you would have thought, if you were to do a hypothetical assumption, the economy should have collapsed. No, it actually did the reverse. So it's a very 6 point, as I said, this year 6.3, next year 7. Even during COVID, it grew. So there's a resiliency within the economy to be able to withstand challenges.
Meanwhile, in a survey done, it has been revealed that global CEOs worry more about being exposed to macroeconomic volatility. Moreover, in East Africa, CEOs worry about inflation in both the short and medium term. Peter Negau, Regional Senior Partner at PwC for EA Region, spoke to CNBC Africa for more.
We carried out a survey, as we do as PwC, between October and November last year, 2022. And we surveyed, Fiona, 4,410 CEOs globally. Out of those, and spread around 105 countries, out of those CEOs surveyed, 138 were from the East Africa region. And I think for me, the key highlight there was that 65% of the CEOs in East Africa, whilst they expected economic performance to decline globally, 60% of them are expecting economic performance in their countries to improve over the next 12 months. So they are alive to the fact that there are global shocks coming. The global economy may not perform as it's supposed to, but they're also very optimistic about performance of GDP in their own countries within the East Africa region. So that's probably the key highlight, the optimism that the CEOs demonstrated in this survey that we carried out between October and November last year.
I mean, even with the optimism that you've touched on, there are still significant challenges that may hinder business operations within the region, just looking at inflation, forex, for example. You are in Kenya. But what are some of the key mitigating factors that business leaders should be able to put in place to be able to cushion themselves against these tough macroeconomic times?
So we are seeing all sorts of things, and based on the CEO survey that we saw that a majority of them, 71% in fact, looking to partner with other players in their industry sectors. But we're also seeing a close focus by the CEOs to reduce their operating costs. 66% of those surveyed in East Africa said that they expect to be reducing their costs or looking at ways to reduce their operating costs in the next 12 months. We also saw that 52% of them are looking to diversify their products and service offerings, while a further 44% said that they are looking to diversify their supply chains by partnering with the different suppliers, because we've seen supply chain disruptions, particularly given geopolitical events, as being a key threat to economic growth and the performance of companies in East Africa. So we are seeing partnering, collaboration within these industry sectors, and also diversification of product services, as well as reducing operating costs as topping the agenda of CEOs in East Africa.
Yeah, we've seen in the last, say, 3 years, presently as well, the business and economic landscape has changed, is constantly evolving. How have we seen this impacting on the types of investment that CEOs are making, or how likely is it going to impact the type of investments coming the next 12 months?
I think what we are seeing from the survey that we've carried out, particularly for East Africa, is that the spend that CEOs are directing in their companies is around upskilling their workforce, preparing it for future performance. There's also a strong focus on investing in technology and being technology ready because of the evolving technological offerings that are there. With that comes risks to them because as technology evolves and develops, one of the key risks that they highlight is the threat of cyber as a risk to their businesses. But the main focus for CEOs, based on what they told us in October and November in East Africa, is upskill their workforce, diversify their product offerings, collaborate, and be ready to face the future by making sure that they are technology ready, while being conscious of the risks that come with that, particularly the cyber risks.
Yeah, I mean, cyber security, as well as going through the report, I saw some of the other areas indicated were climate change as well as sustainability. So what do we see the priorities areas around mitigating these other areas, looking at climate change and sustainability as well?
Yeah, and Fiona, that's a topical issue for CEOs in East Africa. And whilst we haven't seen the large-scale investments that we would expect to see coming into East Africa, CEOs we surveyed are very conscious that they will have to do something over the next year, the next 3 years, to respond to climate change. Investments being planned by a lot of the CEOs that we talk to around reducing their carbon emissions and being very conscious that they need to be carbon neutral as soon as possible. Some of the countries in East Africa are very carbon friendly anyway, because when you look at the sources of energy, in places like Kenya, for example, Kenya is, the sources of power for Kenya are 92% green. It's mainly dependent on hydro and geothermal. So whilst they're in environments that are not significant polluters from an energy consumption perspective, nevertheless, the CEOs are telling us that they are putting in place measures and strategies to reduce carbon emissions and respond to climate risks in their companies.
That's all we can accommodate in this week's episode of Africa Business Weekly. Many thanks to Akin and Balisa for the regional update. We'll be back same time next week for more business stories across the sub-Saharan Africa. I am Kanyisile Kayimpi. Thank you so much for watching.